our final story, different from the others. Wood Squared, Alan's going to come on stage, not with Gary, but with Jean, because Gary was diagnosed at 51, I believe, with Alzheimer's, and Jean, his wife, had to pick up the pieces. I think it's a one-man band business, a very small business, and the pieces have been picked up brilliantly with the help from Wood Squared. So much so that they were able to negotiate. The insurance companies were being completely unreasonable, and yet a great accountant stepped in, and you can see on the screen there, got an extra £18,000 a year payout, a regular payout from the main critical insurance policy. 30,000, on top of that, 30,000 backdated because they've been treated badly up until that point, because the previous accountant hadn't cracked it. A £250,000, you can imagine the difference that this makes to a couple that suddenly discover that life has changed forever. They had a 25k tax bill that we were able to negotiate a nice, comfortable stage payment on. And because the financial worries were taken away, they could pay off most of their mortgage. Jean could go part-time so she could stay at home and look after Gary, improve the quality of life for everybody in the family. And Jean's also been able to do on a part-time basis a master's in counselling, which is useful at home and will leave an even bigger legacy and touch even more people's lives. And staggeringly, as they'll explain, they hadn't actually met until, well, last night, I think. This is only the second time they will have met, and all of that difference has been made already. So would you please join me in welcoming Alan and Jean onto the stage? Our final story. So the usual questions, the clock will start ticking once I ask the first one, which is now. Jean, what were the issues you needed help with, really?
Oh, well, first of all, I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone, and it's really lovely to be back in my hometown. So I'd like to say that first. And I'm absolutely been overwhelmed by the stories this afternoon, really overwhelmed. But as you say, ours is a very different story. It's a story about one family. One family wasn't going to do this.
There are some Kleenex there, Jean, on the far right-hand side of the table, Alan, I think.
Affected by Alzheimer's. And I remember meeting Gary about 15 years ago now, and the first thing he said to me was, one of the worst things that could ever happen to me would be to have Alzheimer's. And I'll take you back to 2012, and just prior to that, when Gary was diagnosed, just to set the scene a little bit. He'd been treated for depression, and he was adamant that he hadn't got depression for about 2 or 3 years before. But our lives were very turned upside down during that period, because I'd lost my eldest son very unexpectedly. My sister had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. We had 3 children going off to university, and Gary was struggling with his memory and doing his job. Up until that point, he'd been a very, very successful IT consultant. We weren't millionaires by any stretch of the imagination, but we were comfortable and we could provide for our children. And very gradually, over a period of time, Gary started to lose his cognitive abilities. And he, in all honesty, when I met him, he was probably one of the cleverest men, the most humblest of men, the nicest of men that you could ever meet. And he worked for his family. His family were the thing that his whole focus of life was on, his family. And he just struggled. He'd phone me at 7 o'clock at night saying, it's taken me all day to do something I used to do in 20 minutes. He couldn't drive. He lost, when he was diagnosed, they took his license away from him. He lost his beloved Harley. So if there's a motorcycle missing, I think it might be an car. But he's got Alzheimer's, so you can't touch him. And when it got to the point that he'd been diagnosed, we knew he'd got Alzheimer's. We knew we'd got an insurance policy. But they weren't going to pay out until we got accounts. And I had never looked at Gary's accounts. And one of the symptoms of Alzheimer's is the total inability to manage money. And his affairs were in a terrible state. I didn't know what to do. His previous accountant, because he owed them some money, were not prepared to help. So I went on a website and I found my knight in shining armour. And I contacted Alan, And right from the start, he just took over everything. We were never going to be a major client. I doubt very much what we bought into his business made any difference. But I can't tell you how much his reassurance that he would do his best to help us. And I knew by this time that the Inland Revenue were going to be owed thousands and thousands. I was worried we were going to lose our house. Gary was worried. His kids were about to go off to university. He couldn't earn any money. So for 2 or 3 years before the diagnosis, he barely earned any money. We had a huge mortgage. We had to remortgage. I was earning a teacher's salary, so I was working 60 hours a week. And poor old Gary was stuck at home, very frustrated because he couldn't do anything. But Alan, he held my hand metaphorically, because I never met him, all the way through. I felt that I was the only client that he'd got, that every time he spoke to me, he was so reassuring, he was so kind, and every time I phoned up, he'd straight away phone me back. Everybody was so supportive, so kind. And when you're dealing with something as devastating as Alzheimer's, you need somebody to show you sympathy and empathy and be kind to you, because I was terrified what the Inland Revenue would do. I was terrified they would take our home away from us. But yeah, so Alan was totally and completely wonderful, and I never realised how tall he was until last night, because you can't see that in an email.
Alan, wow. What did you do to help, and what difference did it make?
Yeah, how do you follow that? Yeah, what we really did, we got the lead through a website called Choose Your Accountant. There may be some people in here that maybe use that particular site. And it was February 2013 that the post was put on there by Jean. I was actually off, I was at home at the time, and I knew straight away as soon as I saw that post that I had to do as much as I could to help whatever the situation was, to try and make that better. Didn't know what that was at the time, didn't even know whether I would be able to help, but I knew that if there was anything that we could do or I could do in business to help with our skills, that would definitely be something that we would do. Today's all about inspiring people and being inspirational, but I was inspired by what Jean had already done. The sort of the effort she'd put in to try and gather as much as she could in terms of the accounts, the bank statements, invoices, speaking to the insurance companies, trying to speak to the revenue, speaking to all these departments without really knowing what to do and how best to do it. So we took on that really and started straight away to speak to the revenue, see what had or hadn't been submitted for Gary in the first place, so that there was no duplication of any information. We contacted the previous accountant, as Jean mentioned, and we got a nice little reply from them to say, we'll let you know where everything's up to, but you'll have to pay us £200 plus VAT for us before we even release any information whatsoever.
You never told me that.
Yeah, no, crazy. So they wouldn't even tell us what they had, so we could have paid them £200 and they may not have had anything. And the fact that the revenue had said nothing had been submitted, we kind of knew there was no real point in sort of, that was a little fruitless task really. So we kind of went from that point then, spoke to Angela at Scottish Providence to try and see exactly what information they would need to be able to increase the amount of payout that they were going to give on the policy. And then liaised with Jean to gather the information that we could to put together the accounts that were needed. Took nearly 2 years, I think, in total, perhaps just under. I think it was November last year when it was kind of all sort of finalised with everything that had been done. But it was probably the most rewarding sort of 18 months in terms of work that I've done personally in that period of time, really. So. And obviously the results for Jean and Gary were fantastic, so even better.
Jean, how did all of that make you feel? How did you feel at the start? How did you feel once it had got better?
Well, I can honestly say that I was terrified to start. I was absolutely terrified. We'd got this diagnosis. It's terminal. Gary, early onset Alzheimer's, you have about 8 years. And I wanted Gary to have a really good quality of life in those 8 years. And financially, we were really, really struggling. So it's made it that we are financially stable. And Gary's now able to do things. He's able to go and watch his beloved Watford. Wait for the booze.
Yes, my team. I didn't know that. Oh, yes.
So there's another one Gary in the world. He's able to go to cricket. He's able to spend time with the family. I've been able to take up a master's in counselling, and I'm working with adolescents, having a really good experience working with young adolescents. I still work at the college where I taught, but I've got a different role completely. I've worked very few hours. They work around Gary. They were more than happy to give me the day off to come here. So it's transformed our life. We were looking at losing our home, losing all our financial security. We now are financially secure, thanks to the work that Alan put in. How he managed to get the deal with HMRC, I will never know. He said, I will start off low. I will start off offering them £200 a month. And I thought, no, they're not going to go for that. And when he phoned and said, they've gone for it, and when I told Gary, he cried. Gary cried. Because Alzheimer's destroys you. It's the most awful thing to watch somebody that you love struggle, and his family were the most important thing, and Alan saved his family, and saved us, and we now have financial security going forward. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know what the future holds for Gary, but it's certainly a much brighter and sunnier future than we would have had.
Wow. Anything else you want to add, Alan?
Yeah, just to sort of make people aware. I mean, lots of coincidences have happened with this, dealing with Jean and Gary, really. September is Alzheimer's Awareness Month, which again is just crazy sort of coincidence that we're sat here today. Gary loves motorbikes, so again, we're in the Motorcycle Museum, so they spent a good hour and a half walking around there earlier. And also what we would be pledging to do if we are fortunate enough to be the ones that you vote for, the £2,500 AVN cheque that we would maybe win on that would go to the local support group in Halifax that supported Jean and Gary, so to help them carry on with their work with supporting people with Alzheimer's. So that's our pledge. Everything we do in business we do to make a difference. We don't do it to make a profit. Profit is a consequence. So that's what we're inspired to do today.
We're inspired too. Thank you very much, both of you. Everything we do in business is to make a difference, but profits are a consequence. It's inspiring. Jean said, Alan saved their family. That's inspiring. Inspired me, for sure. Take a look at the sheet, give them a score as well. So in a minute, you're going to start the voting. We've almost got there. At the risk of sounding crass, yes, profits are a consequence. So in the entries for the book, so 4 of those 6 entries, which are written entries, which will appear in the... Can you imagine a book that's got 70 or 90 stories like the ones you've just heard? The world's most inspiring accountants. We can create change around the world, one accounting practice, one client at a time, by sharing those kind of stories in a more leveraged way. That's what my book, or mine and Susan's book, is going to cover. But it's interesting, in the entries, some of the firms quantified the financial rewards to their firm. Way more important, the impact they've had on people's lives, on Abdul's lives and Ben's life, and the babies' lives and families, and preventing the mother-in-law have to live with you and all that kind of stuff. But rooting it back in the number for the practices, 4 of those firms quantified the impact over the last 3 years from those 4 relationships with 4 clients. Collectively, they've earned £127,000. Profits are a consequence, Alan. You're dead right. Profits are a consequence. When you do great things for people, you get rewarded richly in every way. Emotionally, yes, boy, it's been emotional, but also financially. What a fantastic outcome. Doing stuff that makes a difference, changing the world, and getting paid really well in the process.